Hey, it's Tuesday morning, so you know what time it is. That's right, it's time for the Kitchings Table. Good morning. Welcome to another edition of the Kitchings Table. I'm your host, Earl Kitchings. As always, glad to be with you at 10 a.m. on Tuesday morning. We want to welcome all our viewers and listeners to our show today, thanking WBIS 106.9 LP FM, thanking them for allowing us to be with you. And there are other ways to catch our show. You can catch us on YouTube, Facebook Live, Roku, and GPAC23. Those are the platforms to find us. But you can always catch us as 106.9 FM WBISLP. And every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m., we are so happy and thankful to be with you to provide you with some more information, news, whatever is out there, we're trying to bring it to you. It may not be always as up to the minute current as you like, but we want to bring you what we can, and always wanting to bring you information that makes you go, that's something to think about. And we've done a lot of topics here at the Kitchings Table over the past year, and we are just so thankful that we've been able to make it through a whole year. We're thankful that we don't have to deal with COVID as much as we once did when it was at such pandemic proportions that thousands of people were dying a day. We're glad to see those numbers way down. We're glad that the people who were inventing the medicine for COVID found a way to give us some relief from that. But as I've stated before, you can kill bacteria. You cannot kill a virus, and a virus will be with us forever. And let's just agree that over the next maybe 50 to 100 years, if not longer, we don't know how long COVID has been with us before now, but COVID's going to be with us. It's just something that we're going to have to deal with, and we hope that you take all the precautions. Now, you might wonder why I'm asking you about, talking to you about COVID. No, it's not only from a medical perspective, but because COVID will always have a place in history. Now, there are a lot of things that happen in history that, get on the historic timeline, and some things that get on that historic timeline become iconic. And I like to use that word iconic because it is a level that we know that far exceeds regular, far exceeds the norm, far exceeds just ordinary everyday. Iconic is at a much higher level. And not since maybe the Black Plague, maybe not since polio, have we seen AIDS. I guess that was the last time we saw a medical pandemic have such a dramatic effect. I know when AIDS came on the scene, it just was taking people out. But nothing like COVID-19, this dreaded virus caused more death in a matter of 2 years than probably the Vietnam, World War I, World War II combined. It took out just that many people. So for those of us who are living in this particular day and time, for those young people, as you continue to grow older, as you continue to live life, there will always be something on a historical timeline that will happen that will cause you to go back in your memory and remember what happened. But then there will be those things that, man, you will never, ever forget them, simply because when they happened, they had so much impact. So for children in elementary school age, somewhere between maybe fourth grade and older, college students, high school students, adults in their 20s, 30s, and everyone beyond that, COVID-19, the pandemic, the 2-year pandemic, and it continues to be that, will always be one historical icon on our historic timeline that we will never, ever, ever forget. It will always just mark a place. So, with that, our topic for today is I remember historic, iconic events. Historic, iconic events. And you know that as you get older, your memory holds hundreds and hundreds of important things that make our lives have a purpose each and every day. We remember something, or we have to remember something, or we are reminded of something each and every day. Each and every day. And those things that we are reminded of, or we have to remember, things we have to remember every day: taking our medicine, going to work, maybe taking the kids to school. You think about the things that you have to remember to do each and every day. And then think about the things that happen that are in the world around you each and every day. And then think about those things that are iconic, that stand out head and shoulders above anything else you might ever remember, and what you were doing when it took place or when it happened. And how did it affect you? How did it affect the people around you? How did it affect your communities? Those things are things that get put on our calendar every year because we won't forget them. It's like a birthday. You don't forget your birthday. So most of us don't forget our birthdays. And when it comes around, you always reflect back to what was going on that particular day, good or bad, good or bad. And most times, like anything else with the news, we tend to remember the things that are negative more so than positive. And today we're going to share some iconic timelines from the decades since 1960. And I chose 1960 simply because that's been a 60-year window. And a lot of things have happened during that 60-year window. Simple things, small things, big things, dreadful things, happy things. You run the gamut of everything that could have possibly gone on to be a memory, to be a memory. And that's why we say, I remember, I remember. So over the past 100 years, though, there have been significant national and international events that have taken place. And as I stated, only a few of them, only a few stick with us that we remember. So we're going to share some of those that have happened in history since the 1960s. And I thought about the 60s because the 60s probably was that one decade where we saw so many events take place, so many social events take place, so many historical events from science take place, so sporting events take place. And I don't think, I can't remember or recall a more impactful decade than the 60s. I just don't remember one that had as much going on. And I'm just going to touch on the things that I felt were very, very iconic, that you just can't forget them. And especially, when things hit us as children, they stay with us for a very long time. So I'm going to take us back to the 60s. I'm going to touch on some things in the 70s. The 70s did not have as many as the 60s. Then we're going to go into the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, all the way up to 2020. That's how many historic events have happened. And for the ones I don't touch on, if you just like to write down the ones you remember the most, I mean the iconic ones now. Don't just do the ones that, oh yeah, that happened, this happened. No, I want you to the ones that boom, it put a pin in it. And it's like you'll never forget what happened that day. So when I think back to the 60s, many changes, a lot of marvels, many tragedies. And that's something else to think about. The over time, the number of things that improve our lives, the inventions that improve our lives. You don't think about them until you need them or use them. And every day, someone is coming up with some new invention to improve our lives. Some of them are bigger than others. Some of them are small, but are very, very significant. Some are large, but are not significant. So it just depends. But when I went back to the 60s, I guess the first thing that came to mind was the fact that the United States and Russia were in this battle. No, not a battle on the battlefield, but a battle to get into space. Who would be the first country to get into space? That seemed to be the goal, the mantle, the one place that, from an international standpoint, the only two countries in the world at that time who could actually make something like that happen were battling to see who was going to be the first one to get out there, to see what was beyond the clouds, to see what was out amongst the stars. So the United States and Russia were having this battle back and forth. And Russia launched the first spacecraft that went into outer space, Sputnik, in the early 1960s. The United States was on a mission to not let Russia outdo it. So they started working on the space projects. And, 1961, 62, they finally accomplished that. Colonel John Glenn became the first American to touch the stars, to go out into outer space and be out there for a long period of time. That's who's credited, as the most important space mission at the beginning of the United States venture into space. And the United States did not let that go throughout the 60s. I mean, mission after mission after mission after mission after mission. The rocket kept getting larger, being able to take more. It took more power to get it up and out into outer space, and to keep, stretching that band to see how far we can go. Where can we go? So the 60s probably started with a bang with the space race amongst Russia and the United States. Then we start having another type of race, a musical race, where music started becoming very socially inclined. True enough, we did have jazz and rock and roll that, started many decades before. But this was a new type of musical decade. You had the invasion of these groups from England, and they just poured into the United States. And as many as there were, it was like England was coming up with their music. The United States had rock and roll. But then in the 60s, there was a new music that was really taking America and rhythm and blues under the banner of Motown and Berry Gordy became very iconic music production company that turned out many great groups and many iconic songs that even to this day you hear them and you know exactly who made them. So when we talk about England producing or sending or making popular their groups, of all the groups, there's definitely one in particular that was the most iconic, and then the one behind that was not only iconic but had the longest longevity of those groups from the 60s, because they probably went all the way through the 90s. So you had the Beatles, four-man group, the iconic names of the Beatles that left their impression on the music world. Ringo Starr, George Harrison, John Lennon, Paul McCartney. The Beatles made an impact. Now, one of the things that the Beatles would tell you is part of what made them and what gave them their flair was the fact that they took a page from the playbook of Richard Penniman, aka Little Richard. They had a piece of parts of their music that they took from him and used in their music. They loved American R&B music, which a lot of the English groups did. They found it fascinating. They emulated it as best they could while creating their own style. So you had the Beatles, and behind them you probably had the Rolling Stones with Mick Jagger. So those two English groups probably were the most iconic to come from England and really make a name for themselves. There were many others. And then when we talk about the iconic music producing industry known as Motown and Berry Gordy, Diana Ross, the Supremes, the Temptations, the Four Tops, Smokey Robinson, the Miracles, Stevie Wonder, Gladys Knight, and the Pips, their music became the fabric of Black America. And they kept spinning them out. They churned them out. And it's interesting because in a day and time when music was made on what they call 45 records, which was the small record, a CD is just a little bit smaller than what the old 45 was. But interesting enough, look how much information and music can be put on a CD, and look how much music was put on a 45 record. One song, one side. But these were the people that made this happen. The iconic music industry in the 60s. And you had other companies to spin off other groups and songs. And so many iconic people came out in the 60s. James Brown, Aretha Franklin, the Philadelphia Sound featuring the OJs, just so many groups and songs. So you had that. But at the same time, in 1963, tragedy hit America with the assassination of President Kennedy. That had been the first assassination since President McKinley in the early 1900s. And it's always tragic when a president is targeted to be killed. And I recall being in the fourth grade, and when the news hit our school, they shut school down. They told every kid in the school to go home. They just told children, go home. This is too tragic a day. And the way the tragedy happened, it was just too tragic. So that happened in 63. In 64, the Ford Motor Company came out with their iconic sports car, per se, the Ford Mustang. Lee Iacocca was the developer and designer of that car. And the Mustang has been around. It's getting ready to approach its 60th birthday in 2024. So I can imagine Ford's going to probably have a special edition Mustang for that time. But that car became iconic and everybody wanted a Mustang. And hardtop and convertible. Then they went to fastback. So they did a great job at coming up with a product like that. Also in 1964, after President Kennedy was assassinated, his vice president, President Lyndon B. Johnson, took over. And President Johnson, as staunch of a Texan as he was, put into play two iconic pieces of legislation through Congress, signed off on it. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 that allowed people of color to have the rights that they should have already had to do things, access places in America. The segregation in it started to end. Segregation was not a good thing at all. Segregation was a time when you had places you could and could not go if you were a Black American, things you could and could not do. In the movie theaters, if you had access, they would make Black Americans sit in the balcony areas. If you went to a department store, there would be 4 bathrooms, 2 for whites, male, female, 2 for colored as it was then, male and female, 2 water fountains. Duplication of something that, because of these phobias that people had, and because of their wanting to remain the supreme race of all in this country at that time. So you had this, but the Civil Rights Act changed a lot of that. And then following that, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law again under President Johnson. So you think about that. 1965 also was a time when we had Dr. Martin Luther King to really reach his plateau of civil rights movement, wanting things to change. His march on Washington, where he spoke in front of 200,000 plus people at the Lincoln Memorial. That will always be one of the most iconic speeches ever given in American history. Then also during that time, you had the riots in the cities in America, civil unrest, civil discord. You had people just tired of being abused or having their rights taken for granted or not given opportunities. You could pay taxes, but you can't have full access to things. You're still not treated as equal. So the race riots of the 60s happened in Detroit, Los Angeles, Chicago, and other cities throughout the country. And a lot of property was destroyed during that time. It got the attention of America and the news media, but it was some real serious times where summertime, it was hot, and those riots made it hotter. Then as we got into the latter parts of the 60s, we had tragedy strike us again. Dr. King gave his speech, I Have a Dream, where he had a vision where he was not going to see much more life in his lifetime. So he kind of foresaw his death coming. And you had him to be murdered. Then you had the brother of President John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, who was making a run toward being the president of the United States. He was assassinated. So you lost Dr. King and Robert F. Kennedy in the same year. So you had a double whammy from a historical standpoint, from a social standpoint. People were just really distraught from that. and a lot of anger filled the country at that time. And then at the very end of the decade of the 60s, America put a man on the moon. That was one of the visions President Kennedy had, was to see that a man would make it to the moon, and the United States did with the Apollo mission. So America truly distanced itself from Russia in the space race. But when you listen to all of those things that happened in a span of 10 years, and that's just a snippet, but those are the most iconic events that I can recall in the 60s that had such power and impact and made such a difference. For those of us who were living that time, we remember. For those of us who don't remember but have been told by our parents or grandparents what happened, these are things that we must build our history on, because they happened, good or bad, they happened. So we had to deal with them. Hey, this is the Kitchings Table, heard every Tuesday morning here on WBIS LP 106.9 FM, YouTube, Facebook Live, Roku, and GPAC 23 are the other platforms that provide us an opportunity to talk to you and give you our viewpoints and thoughts about things going on. So today, we're talking about historic and iconic events that happened in America and around the world. And the title of our show is I Remember. And what came to mind as I thought about these iconic events too was this. Some of us, myself included, have lived through some very iconic historic moments. And to live in the 60s and experience all the things that I just shared with you in the 60s as a adolescent and a teenager, that was a lot. That was a lot of things. A lot of things happened in the 60s. Great times. Wouldn't want to change it or do it any other kind of way. I think if there was anything that I could have changed about the 60s, it may have been that Dr. King could have seen a longer life. But his calling left that indelible image on us. And Dr. King is the last American, the first Black American to have a holiday named after them. So for what it was worth, for what he did, for all that he did, we are grateful and thankful. As we moved into the 70s, things occurred. I think one of the, a extension of the 60s that I didn't touch on was a social dress codes that were going on back in those times. The days of, as they call, hippies and people being outspoken, dressing with very outlandish and loud colors. Those were part of the late 60s and 70s. The Vietnam War was coming to an end under President Nixon. President Richard Nixon was elected over Hubert Humphreys in 1968 to be the president. For those of you who may not know it, Richard Nixon was the vice president under President Eisenhower. He had been a politician from the state of New York, so he had been around politics quite a bit. He knew his way around the political world, so he knew, as they say, where some of the dead bodies were buried. But in the 70s, you just saw a lot of the extension of the 60s, but again, the social interaction, the way things were done, people started at least being a little bit more cordial and decent to one another. The voting right age changed from 21 to 18. So instead of having to wait till you become 21, it was moved down to 18. Same thing happened with the purchasing of alcohol. I think it went from 25 to 21. So a lot of changes socially happened. Not as many iconic things of the 70s. But the 70s, I guess, if anything, I recall about the 70s that really was, if you had to put iconic on it, was the fact that, again, music had a very strong place uh, in what was going on. And when we were in college, we always felt that one group identified and defined the 70s unlike any other group, and that group was Earth, Wind, and Fire. Uh, and then you had the rise of other groups. In the late 70s, you had the rise of Prince back in 1976, 77, 78, 79. Prince started coming on the scene and becoming iconic. Michael Jackson had already become iconic after singing with his brothers in the 60s. The Jackson 5 moved to the Jackson, and then Michael totally left them and became just Michael Jackson. And as we know, that was when he started to rise to becoming the king of pop. So the 70s had a lot of social things going on, not like the 70s. Then we move into the 80s. And if any one thing, I guess, may stick with us more so than anything else of the 80s, there were a lot of things that happened. The 1980 Summer Olympics were boycotted. John Lennon of the Beatles was killed. MTV came on the scene in 1981, and that had a dramatic impact on the music culture, because now instead of just hearing music, you could see videos made to music, and MTV had a tremendous impact on the music world, because now if you didn't see them live, you can see their videos. Music TV, that's basically what it was, music television. Judge Sandra Day O'Connor became the first female to the Supreme Court, and many, many other things that happened. The issue of hostages, Iran had made Americans hostage, and they were finally released. The eruption of the Mount Helen out in Washington State, that just a volcanic eruption, a mountain just erupted and spewed lava and dust all over the state. I mean, just unbelievable. But still, with all of those things, even if you add in the fact that a oil tanker, the Valdez, owned by Exxon Oil Company, ran aground in the sound near Alaska and the state of Washington, spilling more than 10 million gallons of raw crude oil, and how much it affected the environment. And between the 70s and 80s, I think that was some of the things that really grabbed America and grabbed the world, was the environment. And here we are 50 years later, where the environment is being pushed to the edge. And if we don't start controlling what we do with it, we're going to be over the edge. But again, in the 1980s, I think if there was one iconic event in history that happened that we will probably not ever forget, was the fact that the Challenger space shuttle exploded about 70 seconds after liftoff. Just totally exploded. Nothing left. As millions watched around the country, the space shuttle was a vehicle that was taking 7 astronauts, scientists, other notable people into outer space. A spacecraft, unlike Apollo, you had a spacecraft that was like a plane that launched scientific experiments, took satellites into outer space. That vehicle, after liftoff, just exploded before our eyes. No one could believe what they witnessed. All that, just a puff of smoke, basically. So the Challenger space shuttle exploding was, I think, one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic thing that happened in the 80s. As we move into the 90s, we continue to see socially the violence that occur. And again, we're talking about iconic historical events. 1995, you had the Oklahoma bombings, which, really had an impact. And of course, you have presidential elections, but those aren't as impactful as things that are negative. So you had the Oklahoma bombings, whereby a federal office in Oklahoma City was blown up. 168 people were killed. 1993, you had President Clinton elected to office at a very difficult time. In that same year, there was a bomb explosion at the World Trade Center, and 1993, 8 years later, the World Trade Center was taken down. We'll get to that. But the political things that were going on, another thing that was, again, of social unrest, Rodney King, a black motorist in LA, was beaten by 4 white police officers, no charges filed. He was beaten pretty bad. They had the Iran-Contra scandal, money and politics going on at that time. 1998, President Clinton was impeached, although it did not go any further than the House. The Senate did not impeach him. So impeachment is impeachment. It just didn't go to the criminal acts that it could have gone to had the Senate impeached him. But in 1999, again, tragedy, where you had the Columbine shootings in Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, where 14 students were killed. So that was impactful in the 90s. And since that time, we've seen many other shootings at our schools, at our businesses, at post office. There was a time when a disgruntled postal employee would go back to their work site and begin shooting people. And the term going postal became associated with someone being very angry and upset and just starting to shoot people at random. That became associated with that. Postal. He went postal. And you kind of knew what that meant. So that's 70s, 80s, 90s. Like I said, a lot of other things happened, but just kind of identifying some of the more iconic things that it just either hurt your feelings, hurt your heart, never left you. And then we get into the decade of the 2000s. And that decade, 1 year into that decade, we have that one tragedy that will always be remembered here in the United States, the 9/11 tragedy, where 2 passenger planes crashed into the World Trade Center and took those 2 buildings down, killing hundreds of people, tearing up New York City. So much destruction and damage caused on that day. You had another plane to hit the Pentagon, and then you had a 4th plane that was shot down somewhere in Pennsylvania on its way to wanting to do some more damage. So that particular day, a well planned out, thought of day, left a lot of tragedy. But what happened in New York City from two buildings that um, well over 80 stories high, both of them, because they were the World Trade Center, there were two very iconic buildings in New York, both knocked down by passenger airplanes in terrorist attacks on the United States. And it left a mark that won't ever be forgotten, washed away, nothing. That left a mark. Ironically enough, the country rebuilt and built a new building on that same site where those two buildings were, and made it not only a building to replace what had been taken away, but it's also a site, a memorial site, a beautiful memorial site that the city of New York in the United States, when you go to New York, you can visit that and just take it all in. Take in what actually happened on one day, September 11th, 2001, when America was attacked. So you had that happen. Then in 2008, the first Black man ever elected president, Barack Obama, was elected to the presidency in 2008. Not only did he serve one term, he served 2 terms. So to see that happen, and I got to tell you, I never thought that would ever happen in my lifetime. I had seen a lot of things since the 1960s. I never, ever thought that I would live to see the day when a man of color would be elected the president of the United States. Of the events that happened between the 9/11 tragedy, I omitted saying that in 2003, another space shuttle exploded. The Columbia exploded in 2003. So you had 2 spacecrafts to blow up as they were leaving to go to outer space. So that happened in 2003. But I don't think anything surpasses the 2 events in the 2000 decade, like 9/11 and Barack Obama being elected president. And then to close out the decade, America and the world lost the probably most iconic music figure to ever walk the planet when Michael Jackson died. And that happened in 2009. So those things happened in the decade of the 2000s. And now we get to the decade for which we just left, 2010, moving on to 2020. But in 2010, you had the Black Lives Matter movement come about in 2013. 3 Black female activists started using social media, hashtag Black Lives Matter, in response to Trayvon Martin being killed senselessly by a supposedly security guard, wannabe security guard on an apartment complex, George Zimmerman, who just killed this young man because he thought he was a threat. He felt that his life was being threatened, and he just took him out. Then you had the Me Too movement that happened in 2017. And that movement dealt with long-time accusations of sexual harassment and assault by a influential Hollywood movie producer, Harvey Weinstein. Accusations or charges or things of that nature were made against him, and he eventually resigned his position, and his life spiraled downward after that. Also in Decade of 2010, you had several massive hurricanes. And I thought the hurricane back in 1992 was devastating. It devastated Miami, I'll say that. But 2012, you had Hurricane Sandy, which definitely had an impact on the New Jersey, New York coastline. $70 billion in damage. 2017, you had Harvey, Irma, and Maria strike Florida, Texas, and Puerto Rico. You had Catalina to tear up New Orleans and just devastate it as a hurricane of note. Katrina. And when we talk about one particular hurricane, Hurricane Michael, the first Category 5 hurricane, it caused, just by itself, caused $25 billion in damages to the Florida coast. I mean, just really tore it up. On some positive notes in sports, finally, the Chicago Cubs win the World Series. Over 100 years since they had even been to the World Series. They finally got that monkey off their back. They defeated the now Cleveland Guardians, once upon a time the Cleveland Indians. And then of all the sports events that may have happened in the decade of 2010, Simone Biles, notably, arguably the greatest gymnast ever to set foot in a gymnastic competition, won 4 gold medals in 2016 at the 2016 Olympics, went on to close out the decade winning 5 more gold medals at the World Championship in 2019. So in all total, Simone Biles won 25 world medals, 19 gold, the most of any gymnast, male or female, in the history of the sport. And then in 2016, we had another iconic music figure leave us when we had Prince, one of the greatest. I would say he and Stevie Wonder, the 2 greatest music icons ever. My own personal opinion. That's just the way I see it. Then we get into the decade of 2020. We're going to start off with the fact that one president got impeached 2 times. Not 1 time, but 2 times. Donald Trump was impeached twice. Although the Senate would not go along with what he had done, the House impeached him for 2 different things. He got impeached twice. The only president to be impeached twice. Then you had the George Floyd trial. Again, innocent man killed by a police officer. The police officer was found guilty. 9 minutes that he imposed his will to apprehend and hold George Floyd, and eventually killing George Floyd. That police officer was found guilty. Then you had the Ahmaud Arbery trial with 3 white men in the community in Brunswick, Georgia, thought that Ahmaud Arbery, a young black man, was creating some kind of criminal trespassing, and they just felt the need to harass him, and they ended up one man shooting him. The father was an accessory, and then the man who videotaped the whole incident was charged as an accessory. They are all now serving life terms in prison. And then finally, just like 9/11, the most iconic event to happen in this decade, and this at the beginning of the decade, just like 9/11, was the insurrection assault by thousands of Americans on the United States Capitol. They attacked the Capitol. They attacked the police officers. They went in the Capitol and did property destruction. A couple of police officers died. One civilian died. But the fact that they stormed the Capitol building, the Vice President of the United States had to be secured in the Capitol building. I mean, just unbelievable activity. The insurrection on the Capitol in 2020, I would rate that as impactful as the 9/11 assault on New York City and the World Trade Towers. We're still waiting to find out what's going to happen from the 2020 insurrection, the January 6th insurrection. They're still going through that hearing. More information is being found out, and it's coming to light that former President Donald Trump and many of his supporters, his minions, whatever you want to call them, had a lot to do with what happened that day. As you may or may not know, he is the catalyst for that day happening. So that's going to do it for us today on our topic today. I remember historic, iconic events in our history over the last 60 years. Hope that something made you remember and caused you to think where you were and what you were doing. We're always glad to be with you here on WBISLP 106.9 FM, awesome radio. And we are glad that we can be with you on another Tuesday. So until next Tuesday at 10 a.m., I'm Earl Kitchings saying so long from the Kitchings Table. Stay safe. COVID is still alive. And don't forget to go out and register to vote and vote come November. Take